Well, good morning. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff_2020. And we're finishing out 2020 with a full-on assault on the deep state. And part of that is identifying, who, why, what, and how in the heck have they been able to do all this stuff. And so when I see that somebody in the past has already covered the ground that I need to cover, I just want to applaud them and say thank you. And in this case, as with last week on William Barr, the whole idea of mind control it's everywhere. You can find it everywhere in on the internet, and you can see all kinds of books and stories about it. But where exactly did it start? Who began it, and who was involved in it in this country? Well, again, I one of the big themes of my channel is I don't need to reinvent the wheel. I don't have to do original research when somebody else has already written the book. And in this case, I'm starting a little series that I started with William Barr a week ago to mine the gold that we can find in the pages of EIR, the Executive Intelligence Review, published for, I don't know what, maybe 30 years and still going strong. Maybe longer than that. Somebody will correct me, I'm sure. But you can find it at larouchepub.com. And this is one that it's so timely because not only does it fit in with this Ezekiel Emanuel, the brother of Ram, who is now hopefully getting infamous for his comment about after 75, your life is pretty much over and worthless. And how does that resonate with all the books I've been reading about eugenics, the population reduction program that really does come from the bankers, the same bankers that we were talking about with Harley Schlanger, the bankers of the City of London, and those associated national, central banks. Well, what is going on with the idea of mind control, and are we not missing another aspect of this? I guess I would almost say Luciferian conspiracy. And when you consider Alan Dulles being right in the middle of it, then you have to consider that, that our government has been engulfed in this for many, many decades. So now we have an opportunity to peel back the layers. But once again, I'm going to read as much of this as I can. I'll skip a few parts, but let's see. Has everybody can hear me all right, I hope. Let's see. Yeah, okay. I'm looking at my level now. Cool. All right. Excuse me while I go over to the EIR page at larouchepub.com. And you can feel free to read along with me. I'm going to read a good bit of it. It's just full of stuff you need to consider, and the resonance with other things that we've been studying just tells me this is right. This is, subject to your vetting it. But I think this is a wonderfully written article from 1994, and the original title is British Psychiatry, From Eugenics to Assassination by Anton Chaitkin. A behavior control research project was begun in the 1950s, coordinated by the British Psychological Warfare Unit called the Tavistock Institute, with the Scottish Rite Masons, the Central Intelligence Agency, and other British, U.S., Canadian, and United Nations agencies. The project became famous in the 1970s under a CIA code name MK Ultra. Its notoriety for brainwashing by drugs, hypnosis, electroshock, and other tortures caused many books to be written about this subject, and the U.S. Senate conducted hearings which exposed many of its abusive features. President Gerald Ford appointed a commission headed by Vice President Nelson Rockefeller to correct the CIA's misconduct. There was a widespread anti-establishment view at the time that here was the fox appointed to guard the henhouse. And wow, don't you agree with that now? And Ford, of course, was part of it. He was in on it, and I'm not even sure that he might have been a victim of it or a subject of it. Gerald Ford, the what was the University of Michigan? They had a nickname for him. Can't remember what it was. Where's David Underdown? He'll tell us. Wow, excuse me. I forgot to use my mute button. And tell you, a mute button is a great thing to do when you're having a sip of coffee. The intelligence agencies offered a public rationale for the project, the need to counteract and compete with the mind control capabilities of the communists. Well, where have we heard that from before? You know, we have always used the same excuse, and in particular, the nuclear arms race. Well, it's the same thing with mind control. Obviously, from the characters that we've been reading about, from Alan Dulles to Richard Helms to, just the real cutthroat people like Ted Shackley, this is just another weapon in their arsenal. That's all. They don't really have any moral qualms about it. All right, I'm going to skip ahead to the beginning of his actual history, and it begins with John D. Rockefeller. Now, just by chance, last night, Saturday night, my last show, I was reading from this brand new book called Killing the Planet by Rodney Howard Brown and Paul L. Williams. And, the very next chapter that we come to is all about John D. Rockefeller, and he, to put it in a nutshell, was the first great monopolist who took advantage of just the most obvious but also despicable business practices to achieve a total control of the railroads, and to have a deal with that was got a discount where everybody else had to pay more, and it just was over and over again. Well, excuse me for not telling the story anywhere near as well as they will when I read this chapter, but John D. Rockefeller is where we start with reading here from Anton Chaitkin, his article in EIR, October 7th, 1994. From 1909 to 1913, the build-up to World War I, John D. Rockefeller created the family-run Rockefeller Foundation in parallel with the birth of the British-inspired Federal Reserve, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In 1909 to 13 and subsequent years, Rockefeller transferred blocks of the family-owned Standard Oil Company worth more than $300 million to the account of the foundation, under its trustees who were family members and their employees. Thus was established a global instrument for radical social change using American money and British strategy. John D. Rockefeller had begun his oil business in the 1860s with British capital. The family's relationship to the British empires half a century later was centered in the person of John D.'s brother, William Rockefeller, the president of Standard Oil of New York, later Mobil, and the founder of National City Bank, later Citibank. In 1911, Brother William employed in a private capacity through his elite social club a high-ranking British Secret Intelligence Service officer named Claude Danzy. As the United States prepared to ally itself in World War I with its old enemy, Britain, Danzy personally reorganized the U.S. Army Intelligence Service into an adjunct of the British Secret Service. Danzy's loyal U.S. followers, General Marlborough Churchill, soon became Director of U.S. Military Intelligence, he a distant relative of Winston Churchill. After World War I, General Churchill headed up the, quote, Black Chamber, a New York-based espionage group serving the State Department, the U.S. Army, and private New York financiers loyal to Great Britain. This same General Churchill would soon launch a medical research organization, the Macy Foundation, M-A-C-Y, for the Rockefellers and British intelligence. The 1920s, the pre-Hitler era in Germany. The Rockefeller Foundation poured money into the occupied German Republic for a medical specialty known as psychiatric genetics. Now, that's pretty early on in history to be talking genetics, is it not? All right. This field applied to psychiatry the concepts of eugenics, otherwise known as race purification, race hygiene, or race betterment, developed in London's Galton Laboratory and its offshoot eugenics societies in England and America. The Rockefeller Foundation created, and Foundation executives thenceforth continuously directed, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Psychiatry in Munich. Parentheses, before Rockefeller sponsorship, it was known as the Kraepelin Institute. And the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Eugenics, and Human Heredity. The Rockefellers' chief in both these institutions was the fascist Swiss psychiatrist Ernst Rüden. Ernst Rüden, and that's R-U with the umlaut, D-I-N, assisted by his protégés, Rockefeller functionaries Ottmar Freiherr von Verscheuer and Franz J. Kallmann. A British medical historian friendly to the Rockefellers recently explained how the family was introduced into this field in Germany. The Foundation's, quote, German centers combined the search for organic signs of mental illness with eugenic projects. The Kraepelin Institute had initially been endowed with 11 million marks, contributed by Gustav Krupp, von Bohlen, und Halbach, head of the Krupp Steel and Arms family, and James Loeb, that's L-O-E-B, Paul Warburg's brother-in-law, an expatriate American of the Kuhn-Loeb banking family. Loeb mobilized his American Jewish friends to support the Institute, and they invited the Foundation to reorganize and expand the Munich enterprise. Loeb was continuously financing the Institute. Loeb's relatives, the Warburgs, owners of the Kuhn-Loeb Bank, were the intimate banking partners of William Rockefeller. Together with him, they had set up the Harriman family in big business, using capital supplied by the British royal family's personal banker, Sir Ernst Cassel. The three families, Rockefeller, Warburg, and Harriman, together with British Crown agencies, jointly sponsored much of the social engineering enterprise we shall describe here. Okay, so there you go. It's Rockefellers, Warburgs, Harrimans, and the British Crown agencies. Okay? This is gold stuff. I mean, it's all right here. Now, I wish that he had, detailed footnotes of everything that he's saying. The thing we have to rely on is the fact that at least he's got it written down here in a very concise way. It's stuff that we can check with all the books and subsequent things that have been written since then. But the reason I'm reading it is because it resonates with everything I know so far. Excuse me. And just check in with the chat. Hi, everybody. Good to have you here. 66 people watching. Welcome. Welcome, everybody. And, all right, let's get back to our reading for this morning from EIR by Anton Chaitkin. The Rockefeller Foundation made an initial grant of $2.5 million in 1925 to the Psychiatric Institute in Munich, gave it $325,000 for a new building in 1928, and continuously sponsored the Institute and its Nazi chief, Rüden, through the Hitler era. The foundation paid for a 1930 to 35 anthropological survey of the, quote, eugenically worthwhile population, unquote, by Nazi eugenicists Rüden, Verscheuer, Eugen Fischer, and others. 1930, a new age in psychiatry. Rockefeller family psychologists and race purification experts created a medical research financing conduit, the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation, directed by former Black Chamber and Military Intelligence Chief General Marlborough Churchill. The Macy Group would manage London's most advanced experiments in mind control and social engineering. 1932, Rüden heads Eugenics Federation. The British-led eugenics movement met at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City and designated the Rockefellers Dr. Ernst Rüden as the president of the Worldwide Eugenics Federation. The eugenics movement at the time called for the killing or sterilization of people whose heredity made them a public burden or a national scapegoat. Nazi eugenics in practice. Adolf Hitler was given Germany's chancellorship in 1933 and was soon absolute dictator. Montague Norman, the occultist governor of the Bank of England, propped up Hitler's credit, arranged the armament of Nazi Germany, and guided the strategies of Hitler's powerful supporters, the Rockefellers, Warburgs, and Harrimans. Only a few months after the meeting at the American Museum of Natural History, the Rockefeller-Rüden apparatus became a section of the Nazi state. The regime appointed Rüden head of the Racial Hygiene Society. Rüden and his staff, as part of the task force of heredity experts, chaired by SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, drew up the sterilization law. Described As an American model law, it was adopted in July 1933 and proudly printed in the September 1933 Eugenical News, USA, with Hitler's signature. The Rockefeller Group drew up other race laws, based, as was the sterilization law, on existing statutes from the Commonwealth of Virginia. Ottmar Verscheuer and his assistant Dr. Joseph Mengele together wrote reports for special courts which enforced Rudin's racial purity law against the illegal cohabitation of Aryans and non-Aryans. The T4 unit of the Hitler Chancery, based on psychiatrists led by Rudin and his staff, cooperated in creating propaganda films to sell mercy killing, i.e. euthanasia, to German citizens. The public reacted antagonistically. Hitler had to withdraw a tearjerker Right to Die film from the movie theaters. The proper groundwork had not yet been laid. 1934. Now, here is the part where I think what other people might consider esoteric and a little bit hard to accept can start to bring some closure with this connection with a certain very important part of Freemasonry. So, "1934. The Freemasons study madness." The Scottish Rite of Freemasonry joined the Rockefellers in sponsoring psychiatric genetics, beginning in 1934, under the rubric of research into dementia praecox, i.e. schizophrenia. The highest level of U.S. Masonry, the Scottish Rite was the instrument through which the British Crown had re-established the loyalty of American Masons after the American Revolution. The northern section of the Rite had rallied the Copperheads against Abraham Lincoln's Civil War efforts, aiding the Rite's southern chief, Albert Pike, in secession and in other British white supremacy projects, such as the Ku Klux Klan. For eugenics, the British royal family itself was the Rite's point of reference, the Rite meaning the Scottish Rite. The Duke of Connaught, son of Queen Victoria and brother of King Edward VII, had been Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England since 1901. American Masonic leaders referred to the Duke as, quote, Grand Master of the Mother Grand Lodge of Masons of the World. The son of a German father, i.e. Victoria's husband, the Coburg Prince Albert, the Duke of Connaught was deeply involved in German affairs and was a patron of Britain's New Dark Ages ultra-racialist elite group based in South Africa. Late in 1932, negotiations for Hitler's takeover of Germany took place at the home of Joachim von Ribbentrop, who, as a traveling teenager, had been adopted into the household of the Duke of Connaught. Ribbentrop then became the head of Hitler's Foreign Intelligence Service. As Hitler's ambassador to England, Ribbentrop worked in tandem with the leadership of the clique which employed Hitler as a British surrogate to smash up Europe, the Masonic Grand Master Duke and his nephew, the openly Nazi Edward VIII. Bank of England Governor Montague Norman and Lord Halifax, Neville Chamberlain's foreign minister. 1936 to 38, Columbia University's Chamber of Horrors. In 1936, the Scottish Rite's field representative of research on dementia praecox, Dr. Nolan D.C. Lewis, director of the New York State Psychiatric Institute, reported to the Scottish Rite Northern Supreme Council, quote, on the progress of the 14 research projects being financed by the Supreme Council, unquote. Scottish Rite strategist Winfried Overholzer, the superintendent of St. Elizabeth's Hospital, a federal mental hospital in Washington, D.C., provided overall leadership for the Rite's psychiatric research. Though these projects are shrouded in mystery, one of them with particularly gruesome results has come to light. The study of hereditary degeneracy was proceeding in the Rockefeller Foundation's German enclaves when it hit a snag. Psychiatrist Franz J. Kallmann, protege of Nazi race scientist chief Ernst Rudin, was forced to leave his job. Kallmann was, quote, half Jewish. This was a big blow for Kallmann, who had proved his Nazi credentials at the International Congress for Population Science in Berlin in 1935. At that British-led meeting, hosted by Hitler's Interior Ministry, Kallmann had argued for the sterilization of even the apparently healthy relatives of schizophrenics, along with the schizophrenics themselves, to securely eliminate all the defective germ plasm. Without missing a step, Kallmann immigrated to America and became director of research at the New York State Psychiatric Institute, attached to Columbia University in Manhattan. Now, those of you who have been studying Columbia University, along with, Mark and Bill Taylor and everybody, and myself, are, focus this connection, which I don't think I had before, between MKUltra and Columbia. But doesn't it make sense? Pardon me. Kallmann simply continued in New York the Nazi propaganda work he had been doing for Rockefeller in Germany. The Scottish Rite of Freemasonry paid Kallmann to conduct a study of over 1,000 cases of schizophrenia in order to assert the claim that the mental disorder was inherited. Kallmann's study was published simultaneously in the United States and Nazi Germany in 1938. In the preface, Kallmann thanked the Scottish Rite and his mentor Rudin. He called schizophrenics, quote, a source of maladjusted crooks and the lowest types of criminal offenders. Even the faithful believer in liberty would be happier without those, unquote. He declared sarcastically, quote, I am reluctant to admit the necessity of different eugenic programs for democratic and fascistic communities. There are neither biological nor sociological differences between a democratic and a totalitarian schizophrenic. Kallmann's scholarly American study was used by the Nazi government's T4 unit as part of its pretext to begin in 1939 the murder of mental patients and various other defective people, many or most of them children. Lethal gas and lethal injections were used to kill 200 to 250,000 under this program, in which the staffs for a broader program of mass murder were desensitized and trained. (1939 to 40), the deal for Auschwitz. The German chemical company IG Farben and Rockefeller Standard Oil Company of New Jersey were effectively a single firm, merged in hundreds of cartel arrangements. IG Farben was led up until 1937 by the Warburg family, Rockefeller's partners in banking and in the design of Nazi German eugenics. Following the Nazi invasion of Poland in September 1939, Britain and Germany declared war on each other and World War II began. But later that month, Standard Oil executives flew to the Netherlands on a British Royal Air Force bomber and met with IG Farben executives. Standard Oil pledged to keep the merger with IG Farben going, even if the United States entered the war. This was exposed in 1942 by Senator Harry Truman's investigative committee, and President Roosevelt took hundreds of legal measures during the war to counter the Standard Oil IG Farben cartel's supply operation for the enemy war machine. In 1940-41, IG Farben built a gigantic factory at Auschwitz in Poland to utilize the Standard Oil IG Farben patents with concentration camp labor to make gasoline from coal. The SS guarded the Jewish and other inmates and selected for killing those who were unfit for IG Farben slave labor. The corporate Germany section, President Emil Helfferich testified after the war that Standard Oil funds helped pay for the SS guards at Auschwitz. On March 26, 1940, 6 months after the Standard Oil IG Farben meeting, European Rockefeller Foundation official Daniel O'Brien wrote to the Foundation's chief medical officer, Alan Gregg, that, quote, "It would be unfortunate if it was chosen to stop research which has no relation to war issues." The non-related research continued. In 1943, Ottmar Verscheuer's assistant, Joseph Mengele, was made medical commandant of Auschwitz. Well, I'm going to assume most folks are familiar with what went on there at Auschwitz. If not, it's right here in the next 4 or 5 paragraphs. And now I'm going to go ahead to the next paragraph on 1943 research in America. With the war on, the Rockefeller Foundation and the Canadian military joined their psychiatric forces. Canadian Army Medical Director Dr. George Brock Chisholm had been trained as a psychiatrist at the Tavistock Psychiatric Clinic in London, and Tavistock, the British Crown's central mind-bending agency, was a major Rockefeller Foundation beneficiary. In 1943, the Rockefeller Foundation created the Allen Memorial Institute at McGill University in Montreal. Eugenics-oriented psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron, a Scottish immigrant to the United States, was placed in charge of the Institute's psychiatry. Experiments in coercive interrogation and brainwashing would be conducted at Allen Institute under the auspices of the Canadian military, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. Dr. Cameron's terminal use of electric shock as a brain-burning torture, psychosurgery, and brainwashing with drugs and hypnosis would make the Canadian program the most famous aspect of the CIA's MK-Ultra. Of course, we all remember George Webb's visit there and his own research into this subject and how it's related to his general research, and indeed, is it all related? Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., a new odor, that of marijuana, could be detected inside St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. The superintendent, Scottish Rite Chief Psychiatrist Winfried Overholser, was in 1943 the chairman of the misnamed, quote, Truth Drug Committee of the Office of Strategic Services. The criminal underworld was systematically being brought into official but secret joint activities with the government. And I don't think he put joint in quotation marks, but I think that's exactly what was going on under the pretext of fighting fascism. Overholser's crew administered the hallucinogen mescaline to various test subjects. Then, in the spring of 1943, they perfected the right mix of marijuana and tobacco to produce a, quote, state of irresponsibility in the subject. The official OSS story is that the New York Mafia hitman August Del Gracio began smoking Overholser's joints on May 27, 1943, in order to loosen his tongue. Federal agents were thus supposedly to learn the inside secrets of drug trafficking, but not to stop it. This was part of an ongoing federal program, which organized crime czar Meyer Lansky boasts in his autobiography that he personally arranged. Mafia thugs were brought in to work in naval intelligence offices and jointly with U.S. agents in U.S. ports and shipping to more effectively intimidate our national enemies. Former CIA staff member John Marks writes in The Search for the Manchurian Candidate that Overholser's working group included counterintelligence agents inside the Manhattan Project atomic bomb project and the FBI, which was under the direction of Dr. Overholser's Scottish Rite comrade, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. The Overholser group gave marijuana to U.S. soldiers at Army bases throughout the country, supposedly to aid in the search for subversives. In 1944, with the concentration camps in full swing in Europe, Montague Norman resigned from the Bank of England. He immediately began a new project, ironically related to his own repeated mental breakdowns. Norman organized the British National Association for Mental Health. In its formative stages, the group was based at Thorpe Lodge, Norman's London home, where he had met with Nazi economics minister Hjalmar Schacht to plan the Hitler regime's 1930 budgets. Montague Norman's Bank of England assistant Otto Niemeyer was made treasurer of the National Association of Mental Health. Niemeyer's niece, Mary Appleby, became general secretary. She previously worked in the German section of the British Foreign Office. The president of Norman's association was to be Richard Austin Butler. He had been deputy foreign minister to Lord Halifax and the spokesman in the British Parliament for the pro-Nazi policy. Norman's British group would soon expand to take over management of the world psychiatric profession. When the war ended, the exposure and punishment of those responsible for the Nazi barbarities was a rather delicate matter. Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron interrupted his Canadian brain butchery to go help the British Crown's Tavistock Psychological Warfare Unit evaluate the sanity of Nazi official Rudolf Hess. Cameron's unique insights into the Nazi mentality had made him a valued part of a secret wartime psychiatric committee in Washington to assess the trends in Nazi leadership thinking. Cameron now testified as an expert at the Nuremberg war crime trials. His old OSS colleague Alan Dulles, later the CIA director, was reportedly pleased by Cameron's suggestion that each surviving German over the age of 12 should be given electroshock treatment to burn out remaining vestiges of Nazism. Skipping ahead to 1950s MK Ultra, the outrages perpetrated by Ewan Cameron became the most notorious aspect of the post-war Anglo-American mind control program. Cameron had trained at the Royal Mental Hospital in Glasgow under eugenicist Sir David Henderson and founded the Canadian branch of his friend Dr. John Rees's World Federation for Mental Health. In the various member countries and subdivisions, these channels of British intelligence operations are known as the national, provincial, or state mental health associations. Cameron was also elected president of the Canadian, American, and World Psychiatric Associations. He became famous after the CIA was sued by some survivors of his work because the CIA had financed the tortures. But the authorship of this enterprise cannot reasonably be assigned to the CIA per se. Even before we review other agencies' direct involvement, we must understand that the CIA chief during MK Ultra, Alan Dulles, was thoroughly attached to British Empire geopolitical aims. Now here's part that I think is important. Introduced to British spies by his uncle Robert Lansing, Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State, Dulles had had a strong personal identification since childhood with the British Secret Intelligence Service. The Dulles family's upper-class status in America began when ancestor William Dulles arrived in South Carolina from India, with a fortune made in India by providing financial and security services for the British East India Company Army. He bought a slave plantation from which the family held through the American Civil War. The family's mental life was always that of the British Empire and its American colonial subordinates. Alan Dulles' main corporate activity was as a director of the J. Henry Schroeder Banking Company in London, a prime instrument in Montague Norman's Nazification of Germany. As partners in the Sullivan and Cromwell firm, Alan Dulles and his brother John Foster Dulles represented the Rockefeller-Harriman-Warburg combination, I.G. Farben, and virtually every other Nazi corporate organization that danced on London's marionette strings. It was disclosed that for MK Ultra, particularly for the experimental use and distribution of LSD, the CIA operated through another front, the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation. But the generosity of the front really worked the other way around. The Macy Foundation represented the British Psychological Warfare Executive as extended into U.S. and related institutions. In the midst of launching MK Ultra during the 1954-55, the Macy Foundation's medical director, Frank Fremont Smith, was president of British General Rees's World Federation of Mental Health. Under Rees as the director, the two together made a journey to a number of countries in Asia and Africa to establish contacts and seek ways in which the organization may extend its activities in those regions. The Macy Foundation's chief LSD executive, Harold Abramson, was a psychiatric researcher at Columbia University and at the Eugenics Center in Cold Spring Harbor, Long Island, New York. It was Abramson who first turned on Frank Fremont Smith. Abramson also gave LSD for the first time to British anthropologist Gregory Bateson, sometime husband of Margaret Mead. Then in 1959, Bateson gave LSD to beat poet Allen Ginsberg at Stanford University under controlled experimental conditions. Following this, Dr. Leo Hollister at Stanford gave LSD to mental patient turned author Ken Kesey and others, and thus it was said to have spread, quote, out of the CIA's realm. Masonic charity. Other parts of the U.S. government participated in the project exposed as MK Ultra, The Army Chemical Center paid for LSD and related drug brainwashing experiments by Dr. Paul Hoch. Along with Nazi eugenics leader Franz Kallmann, Hoch co-directed the research at Columbia University's New York State Psychiatric Institute. Dr. Hoch was a member of the American Eugenics Society. In Kallmann's eugenics cell at the Institute, Hoch was simultaneously appointed State Mental Hygiene Commissioner by New York Governor Averell Harriman and was reappointed by the next governor, Nelson Rockefeller. Robert Hannah Felix, 33rd degree Mason, was a director of the Scottish Rite's psychiatric research. He ran a spectacularly lawless brainwashing establishment. The exposure of the MK-Ultra scandal revealed that the CIA had funded one Dr. Harris Isbell to carry out barbarous experiments using slave subjects, all of them black drug addicts, nearly all of them black drug addicts, at the Addictions Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky. Isbell was the director of the center from 1940s until 1963. His boss was the Masonic master psychiatrist Felix, who founded the National Institute of Mental Health and was NIMH director from 1949 to 1964. The Lexington facility had been Dr. Felix's personal project, since he had been its clinical director in the 1930s, and he put it under the jurisdiction of the NIMH. Felix's program was not simply to make humans into controllable beasts, but to decentralize the zombie manufacturing. A 1993 report to the Scottish Rite Supreme Council by its current psychiatric research director, Stephen Mattiza, explains. 30 years ago, a massive program began, which has continued unabated to this day, the deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill. My predecessor, as research director of the Schizophrenia Research Program, Dr. Robert H. Felix, 33rd degree, Gorgas medalist and the founding director of the National Institute of Mental Health, was one of the chief architects of this program. We are entering a new era, he wrote, of community-centered, comprehensive psychiatric care. Dr. Felix predicted that in 25 years, state mental hospitals as we know them would no longer exist. He was right. During the years from 1955 to 1992, the state mental hospital census went down by 82%. The strategists of MK-Ultra succeeded in moving the mentally ill out of costly mental hospitals onto the streets, where they now constitute a large proportion of America's homeless. We shall see what kind of community-centered psychiatric care these strategists did in fact implement, as Britain's MK-Ultra poured drugs into the country and worked to fabricate the drug-sex-youth culture. Well, the article is long. It's too long for me to finish today. Here's another part that I will read, and then I think I'll have to leave the rest of it to you to read over at LaRouchePub.com. The ambiguous rationale for the MK-Ultra program was the search for the Manchurian candidate, to study, emulate, and counterbalance communist programs which brainwash people who could be dangerous to our national security. These programs were secret, and masses of MK-Ultra records were destroyed, but some aspects of the program's direct testing have been divulged. CIA Executive Morse Allen worked at creating killers under hypnosis and on around February 19th, 1954, the CIA planned early in 1954 to hypnotize a man they considered disposable, to get him to make an assassination attempt, be arrested for attempted murder, and be, quote, thereby disposed of. A CIA hypnosis study was done by Alden Sears at the University of Minnesota and was moved by Sears to the University of Denver, Colorado. Sears worked to answer the question, quote, could a hypnotist induce a totally separate personality? CIA counterintelligence chief James Jesus Angleton, a leader of the British intelligence faction in the American intelligence community, established 3 goals for the hypnosis program. 1, to induce hypnosis very rapidly in unwitting subjects. 2, to create durable amnesia. And 3, to implant durable and operationally useful and post-hypnotic suggestion. A test of rapid hypnosis took place in July 1963. The counterintelligence staff in Washington, D.C. asked the CIA station in Mexico City to find a suitable candidate for a rapid induction experiment. The station proposed a low-level agent whom the Soviets had apparently doubled. A counterintelligence man flew from Washington, and a hypnotic consultant arrived from California. The experiment was said to have misfired. According to CIA hypnosis expert Milton Klein, creating a hypnotized patsy is easier than making a totally controlled Manchurian candidate. The patsy can be induced by hypnosis to do things which later show up as circumstantial evidence that will get him falsely blamed for a crime. And isn't that an interesting thing to think about when we think about the Robert Kennedy murder with the supposed Sirhan. And all of these things resonate, but I think I'm not sure if I was able to make my point that I had intended to, just because this article is a little longer than I can manage in 1 hour. But what I'm saying is that mind control is a concurrent goal with population reduction, so that gradually the ones that they are able to control exceed the ones that are not, and then the rest will disappear, either violently or through the passage of time, until there's nobody left except for those that are under control. The idea that that's happening now in our current crisis causes me to say, take this seriously. Look at the connections between the British Crown, the Albert Pike version of Freemasonry, the psychiatric institutes all being part of British intelligence, which makes sense to me. Although I can't prove it, I just think that Anton Chaitkin is somebody that knows what he was talking about. All of this stuff that we can't understand seems to me is, we could see it as, well, that's because we've been under a psychiatric warfare attack. And, you know, are we not right now in the midst of a huge battle? As Harley Schlanger says, know your enemy. And the indication is that the enemies that are identified here go back to the Rockefeller, Harriman, Warburg, British Crown, British intelligence system. So, thanks very much for being with me here on McDuff Channel, and I'll be back tonight reading some more from the book Killing the Planet by Rodney Howard Brown and Paul L. Williams, where we will pick up with John D. Rockefeller and move quickly forward into the present time.